Hey guys, I'm Naguura, and today I'm going to talk to you about how to properly prepare for the new raid. I know it can be pretty tedious and annoying to learn all of those different bosses, all of the new abilities. It just can be very overwhelming, but I personally found a very good way on how to prepare myself properly, and I'll share it with you guys today. So this is a pretty thorough way of preparing, and I'm sure most of you don't want to spend the time to do all of this. But I definitely recommend doing this if you want to impress your guild, or if you're currently a trial and you want to make sure you're getting promoted to that member spot, or if you just generally want to be as prepared as possible for the raid. So first of all, let's take a look at the steps you should be taking. Number one, of course, you want to be preparing your character. Let's talk about legendaries first, because some of you might not have gotten your best in slot legendary yet, because it might have gotten available just this reset. So if your best in slot legendary drops from a world boss, or it drops from one of the 2 Torghast wings that just got available this week, then do try to get that legendary recipe before the raid and craft your legendary if it's required by your guild. Of course, there are some guilds who are holding on to their legendaries or crafting the legendaries until the end of the week because of the tuning that is going to happen very likely throughout the normal mode and heroic week. But if your guild wants you to craft the legendaries, make sure you do it before the raid. Then make sure you enchant and gem your gear, of course. Now remember to put a main stat gem from BFA into your gear if that's actually better than the secondary stat gems from Shadowlands. For some classes, the main stat gem, which gives 7 main stat, might actually be better than the secondary stat gems from Shadowlands, because our main stat has such a high value at the start of an expansion. So make sure you are simming your character and figuring out your stat values. And if your main set is better, make sure you're using that gem. If you don't know how to sim your character, then keep an eye on my channel. I'm going to be posting a video on how to sim your character very soon, so that might help you out. All right, now moving on to consumables. Having flasks, potions, and food is very important, of course, so make sure you come with all of that unless your guild is providing it. But don't forget about the Shadowlands consumables that are newly added to the game. For example, the weapon buffs. There's sharpening stones now, and there is oil as well. And some of these buffs are actually interacting with the potions, so it might be a pretty big damage loss to not have them. So make sure you get them. Also make sure you have the heavy desolate armor kits, because those give you just an extra stamina boost on your chest. And it's just very important for progression. It's something you have to put on your chest every 2 hours, and it can be pretty annoying, but just make sure you have them on your first raid. Then another thing I wanted to talk about is the change of the potion city. Now, in the past, we used to pre-pot before we got in boss combat, and then when the city was ready again, we used the potion one more time throughout the boss fight. But now, potions have a flat 5-minute cooldown. No matter if you use them in combat or out of combat, it doesn't matter. So what does this mean? This means you can use your potions more flexibly throughout the fight. That means you can choose to not use a potion at the pool, but rather use it later on, depending on the boss fight length. If the boss is less than 5 minutes, you can only use 1 potion anyway, because the potion cooldown is not going to be ready again, right? So then you can decide, where do I use this potion? You could use it at the pool, if that's going to be the most important phase where you use bloodlust and everything. But if maybe there's an execute phase or a more important phase later on in the encounter where you're saving your bloodlust for, you need to have the most damage right there, then I would also hold my potion for that moment. Now, if the fight is longer than 5 minutes and you can use 2 potions, then you have to rethink again. You probably want to use 1 potion early on and then use the second potion later. All right, and lastly, make sure you have veiled augment runes if it's really needed for certain bosses. Of course, they're very expensive and they're a one-time use. They disappear when you die. So it's definitely a very expensive consumable, but if your guild is requiring it for certain bosses, specifically for maybe mythic progression, make sure you get them, because they're going to be very expensive. So check the auction house for some times where you might get some cheap ones. Now we're going to be moving on to understanding the boss fights and preparing your UI. I personally always combine those 2 steps because I think it goes well together. And I personally think it's very, very important to work on your UI specifically for the raid, to be able to set up everything together, understand the fights, and have a perfect UI that matters for your needs and also helps you to play the boss fight better. Now let me explain what I mean. Okay, so first of all, I am installing a WeakAuras pack by someone who provided WeakAuras on vago.io for all of Castle NATHRIA. I personally use Relo's WeakAuras pack, but I'm sure there's other WeakAuras packs out there and you can choose whichever you prefer. So I installed the WeakAuras pack, I imported it into my WeakAuras, as you can see here. This is my already adjusted one. But I just basically have all of these WeakAuras now that are in this dynamic group. A dynamic group on WeakAuras means that there's basically one spot you put them in and they will always appear in the same spot. Unless you have multiple ones, then they will adjust to the left or to the right, and then they will just build upon this spot. I personally don't like just installing a WeakAuras pack and just going with it, because I think they have so many WeakAuras for all of these different abilities because people might want them, that at some point it's going to be overwhelming information. Some of the WeakAuras are more important, others are less important, some of them might be completely irrelevant to you. And because there's just so many, if you don't adjust them at all yourself, if you just install the pack and keep it as it is, then I feel like the information you're getting from the WeakAuras is very limited and you're getting basically overwhelmed by the information. Because if there's a bunch of WeakAuras that pop up on your screen that are irrelevant to you, then you kind of remember, your brain remembers that, oh, the last time there's something that popped up and it wasn't actually relevant. So if this continues happening, that you have a bunch of WeakAuras that are actually not important, then whenever there is something important that pops up, your brain might not immediately recognize this as an important ability because you're used to having non-important WeakAuras pop up in this very same position, right? So what I personally do to prepare my UI perfectly for a raid is, as I'm learning the boss fights through YouTube guides, I'm watching guides like Fat Boss TV, or I'm watching Ready Check Pull guides on my second screen. And as I'm watching the guides, I also open up my dungeon journal and I look at the boss's abilities as they're being explained in the YouTube videos. And I also look at my WeakAuras at the same time, and then I adjust them accordingly, right? For example, here on Relo's WeakAuras, you can see he has a number for each boss in front of the WeakAuras name, right? You see, this is a 10th boss, this is the 9th boss, and so on. So I start with the first boss usually, and I look at the number 1 WeakAuras, and then I look at the abilities that I see on the dungeon journal, and I familiarize myself with the boss by looking at the guide and by looking at the dungeon journal and so on. And once I've understood how the fight works perfectly, then I will look at the WeakAuras that are actually in the WeakAuras pack. I've already adjusted the WeakAuras, so I've already deleted some of them, but these are the WeakAuras that I am left with. So I moved them out of the WeakAuras pack, I removed them out of the group, and I added them to my own group. I made my own group. You can do that by, at the top left, there's something that is called New Aura, and then there's something that is called Group. I personally do not like a dynamic group, and I can explain to you why. Dynamic groups basically just make all of your WeakAuras pop up in the same position, and I personally think it's better to adjust the positioning of your WeakAuras, because more important WeakAuras or more important abilities should be more middle, while less important ones should be maybe further to the side. At least that's what I like doing. If you prefer it a different way, then just make sure you figure out the way you like it. But yeah, you can just add a group by clicking on New Aura and press Group. And then once you created the group, you rename it to Castle NATHRIA, Raid, or whatever you want to call it. And then you just put the WeakAuras that you want to keep inside this group, and you remove them from the WeakAuras pack that you installed. In my example, it's the Relo WeakAuras pack, right? So I moved them out of that group and moved them in my group. So these are the WeakAuras I have enabled for the first boss. You can see I added different sizes to the WeakAuras, and I changed one WeakAuras to a bar instead of an icon. And what I can also recommend is change the sounds as well. The way you change the sound is not actually that hard. You just have to click on the WeakAuras, and then you go to Actions at the tab there, and then you click on Play Sound, and you can select a sound here, for example. So I personally like adding different kinds of sound to different important WeakAuras. I don't like adding a sound to every WeakAura, but to very important ones I do like adding a sound, and then I want them to be different depending on the ability, because I want to add as many cues as possible to one WeakAura. So for example, if there's a very important ability that happens on a fight, then not only does the WeakAura pop up, but it also pops up in a specific position where I put the WeakAura in, and the specific sound that I put to the WeakAura also sounds. So in this situation, I have 3 different cues. 1, the WeakAura popped up. It's the first cue, right? Second, the position where it popped up already gives me a cue as well. And third, the sound that is associated to that ability. So if I'm missing either of those things, like if I'm missing the WeakAura pop-up itself, but then I hear the sound, or I don't hear the sound because I hear something else, or I'm just like distracted, then I might see the WeakAura pop-up, right? So any of those cues might remind you that this ability is happening, and then you can react better. If all of the WeakAuras are popping up on the same spot, and all of them have the same sound, and all of them have the same size, then it gets hard for you to distinguish the abilities as they're happening. So that's why I like to add lots of different variations to the WeakAuras to make sure that I associate the certain WeakAura with a specific ability. As you can see, this is for the first boss. I put 1 bar, I put 1 middle WeakAura, and then I put a bunch of different sizes as well, and also different positions. Now, I like to also remove WeakAuras from the WeakAura packs. As I mentioned before, some of the WeakAuras that are in WeakAura packs are pretty irrelevant. So I like to just completely remove those and only have the ones that I really care about. So here's what I do. Like before I do the first raid, I remove as many WeakAuras as possible and only have the relevant ones. Then I go into the raid and I play the boss fights. And if I think there's a WeakAura that is missing that might actually be relevant to me, then I add it later on. Because I think it's better to have less information at the start and then add WeakAuras later on as you figure out that you need them, than to completely overwhelm your UI with WeakAuras popping up everywhere. And then you don't know, okay, which ones do I not need? Which ones do I need? You're just completely overwhelmed. And you just don't know which one you should be paying attention to and which one you shouldn't. So that's why I personally like to remove as many as I can at the start, only add the important ones, only add sound to the even more important ones, and then work from there. So another thing I like to say is that I sometimes add WeakAuras that are less important but still might want to be looked at sometimes in a different position that is not the middle. The middle WeakAuras should only be for WeakAuras that are very important, first of all, and second of all, that are not there for a long time. I do not want to have a WeakAura in the middle of my screen that is there for 2 minutes, right? They should only be there for a very short time, and if you ever need to add a WeakAura that is there for a longer time than that, then I like to move it in a different position. So, for example, there's this WeakAura, for example, it's called Destabilize, which just shows me the damage increase on my target. And I put it over my target frame because that's exactly where I'm going to be looking, right? Because it only shows up on the target that I've selected, and it's a boss that basically just gains damage, or where the ads gain damage. So this is the perfect position for that WeakAura because I don't want to always see it in the middle of my screen, but I do want to see it as I'm looking for it to see how much damage I'm gaining. And same for debuffs. If I have a debuff on myself that lasts a decently long time, that I think is pretty important for me to see, then I put it over my character frame, because I think that's where I look at when I want to see my health. And that's where I look at when I want to see, is there anything damaging me? Is there any debuff on me that I need to get rid of? What do I have to do? And that's when I think it's pretty important to have your health bar on top with your WeakAuras that are displaying your debuffs, right? If they are relevant debuffs. I am not displaying irrelevant debuffs because then I can just look at my debuff bar if I want to see it, right? All right, and once I have figured out all of the positioning of my WeakAuras, then I also work on my BigWigs and on my rate frames. So I basically open up my BigWigs or DBM, doesn't matter, you can use whatever you want, they both work just fine. I go to my rate tab and I go through the boss's abilities after I've learned the bosses, of course, so after watching the videos. And then I go through the abilities. Are there some abilities that I don't actually want to see a timer for example? It's possible, like if I'm not a tank, I don't necessarily want to see the tank timers, because that's pretty relevant information to me that I can't do anything with, right? So I want to remove the irrelevant information, and I want to emphasize the very relevant information, specifically countdowns. I personally really like adding countdowns, and what that does is just a voice counting down from 5. It's counting down 5, 4, 3, right? And this is just like a audio cue for an ability that is happening and something that you need to prepare for. For example, this ear-splitting shriek is something that you have to hide from. This is an ability where you need to go line of sight. So if you have a timer for this, like a countdown, then you know, oh, this ability is happening soon. I'm gonna go slowly towards the pillar where I need to line of sight. So you don't get surprised by this ability with the countdown, and you can slowly prepare for it, right? Specifically for a range damage dealer, this is really good because then you don't lose a lot of damage. If you slowly walk to the pillar, you're gonna lose a lot less damage than if you all of a sudden have to just like start running because you didn't have a countdown and all of a sudden the ability starts happening, right? And the way you add the countdown is by going to the ability, in this case, ear-splitting shriek. You click here, and then you add this countdown here. All right, I only like adding one countdown per phase on a boss. I don't want to have multiple countdowns overlapping throughout a boss fight, because then I cannot associate the ability with the countdown immediately. And I don't want that to happen, right? If I hear the countdown, I want to immediately know it's this ability that is happening, right? I just want to completely associate one ability with a countdown. If a boss has different phases, then it's okay to add multiple countdowns per phase, but not if you have 2 countdowns in one phase. And last but not least, I am setting up my rate frame. I am using Voodoo, but this can be used for any rate frame that you're using. I personally am by default, am not seeing any debuffs. Okay, so by default, debuffs are not being displayed on my rate frames. I add the debuffs I want to see manually. And the reason why I do that is just because I don't want to be overwhelmed by debuffs that I don't care about. I only want to see really important WeakAuras that I can actually do something about and that matter. If there's a bunch of debuffs that I don't want to see, that I can't do anything with, then they're just like overwhelming my rate frames, and then I don't notice the important debuffs anymore. Now, I'm not a healer main, I'm actually a range DPS main, so this is just an extra step that I am taking as a damage dealer that most damage dealers are not really doing. I think that 99 out of 100 times, it probably doesn't matter that you set up your rate frames perfectly with your debuffs, but this one time, you can save your rate from a wipe because you see a certain debuff on your rate frame that maybe no one else notices, and you can somehow save them by throwing an off heal if you're a hybrid class, or you can taunt an add off of the tank because the tank is about to die to a debuff or something like that, right? If there's anything you can interact with and any debuff that you can somehow help out with, then you're gonna be the hero and you're gonna be so happy that you set up your rate frames properly. So I really like doing that, and I think it also helps with overview of the fight, because you get a better understanding of what's currently going on in the raid by being aware of the important debuffs across your rate frames, right? So I really, really recommend doing this. I have added a lot of debuffs already. I'm going to be posting a list of these debuffs in the description below, so you can add them to your rate frames if you want to. I'm going to be giving you the spell IDs of all of these buffs. I haven't added all of them yet, but I'm going to make sure to update this as soon as I have added all of them. All right, this is going to be it. I really, really hope that this video helped you on how to prepare for the raid properly. I know this is a really long process to do, but I really recommend going through this process if you want to be setting your character up properly for the raid, and if you want to be as prepared as possible. And I can promise you, if you go through these steps, you're going to be knowing the bosses better than anyone else, and you're going to have such a good time in the raid going in. You're going to be impressing your raid members a lot. And yeah, I just wanted to say one more thing, that all of these WeakAuras that I adjusted, again, the initial pack is from Relo. I adjusted them myself. But if you want those adjusted WeakAuras and the rest of my UI, it's available on Twitch for my subscribers. But remember that I really encourage you to do this yourself. Because if you're just going to take my WeakAuras, then yeah, they're set up, but you didn't set them up yourself, and you didn't add the sounds, you didn't add the position, you didn't add the size of the WeakAuras. So if you just use my WeakAuras, it's basically the same as installing a WeakAura pack. It's really not much different. So you can't get around the fact to set up your own WeakAuras, unfortunately. I really encourage you to do it if you want to be as prepared as possible. All right, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you as always. Remember to subscribe to my channel if you like this video, and give it a like as well. I would really appreciate that. Thank you very much, guys, for watching, and I'll see you at the next video. Bye!